Imagine you are standing on a cold street corner in Manhattan in 1932, watching a bread line wrap around 3 city blocks. You see the banks locked tight with heavy chains and the local factory silent as a tomb. At that moment, global debt was a tiny fraction of what we see today, yet the entire world felt completely broke. You probably think saving every penny is the responsible thing to do when times get tough. But what if your personal virtue is actually a collective vice that kills the economy? How did a quirky British intellectual convince the world that the only way to save a nation was to spend money it didn't have? John Maynard Keynes wasn't your typical dusty academic. He was a math prodigy and a high society socialite who moved in the most elite circles of London. Before he stepped onto the scene, the old school economists had a very simple rule for the world. They believed markets would always fix themselves if you just left them alone. If people lost their jobs, wages would eventually drop. Business owners would then start hiring again because labor was cheap. It sounded perfect in a textbook, but by the early 1930s, that eventually was taking far too long. People were starving while the experts told them to wait for the invisible hand of the market. Keynes looked at the empty factories and the hungry workers and saw a fundamental flaw. He realized the problem wasn't a lack of resources or a lack of talent. The buildings were still there and the workers were ready. The problem was a total collapse in demand. Everyone was too scared to spend a single dime. Since nobody was buying anything, nobody was hiring. It was a vicious circle. Keynes called this the paradox of thrift. You watch as a single family stops going to the theater to save money. Then the theater owner can't pay the baker. Then the baker can't pay the farmer. If everyone tries to save at once, the whole economy shrinks until there is nothing left. This is where Keynes dropped his bombshell theory. He argued that the government had to be the spender of last resort. This was pure economic heresy at the time. That during a crisis, the government should borrow and spend to get the gears turning again. He famously suggested that if the government couldn't find anything useful to do, it should bury jars of cash in old coal mines. Then, it could let private companies dig them up. The point wasn't the jars, the point was the jobs created and the money flowing back into the shops. You might wonder if this was just a temporary fix for an extreme emergency. Keynes thought he was providing a toolkit to manage the highs and lows of the business cycle. He wanted governments to save during the good times and spend during the bad ones. It was a brilliant, logical plan on paper. But he may have underestimated one thing. He didn't account for how much politicians would love the spending part and how much they would hate the saving part. Finance people still go back and forth on whether Keynes actually saved capitalism or just gave governments a permanent excuse to live beyond their means. By the time he published his masterpiece in 1936, the world was already changing. The old rules of the gold standard and balanced budgets were crumbling. Governments were beginning to realize that they had a new superpower. They could print, borrow, and build their way out of a hole. It felt like a miracle cure. But as the 1930s turned into the 1940s, the world was about to see what happens when the government spending machine shifts from recovery mode to war mode. After World War II, it felt like the world had finally found the secret sauce for eternal prosperity. For about 25 years, the Keynesian playbook worked almost perfectly. Governments across the West took charge of their economies like never before. They built massive highway systems and funded huge social programs. You look at the skyline of a 1950s American city and see a world being rebuilt by government checks. It was the golden age of capitalism. Unemployment stayed low and the middle class exploded in size. Tax revenue was flowing in, but governments weren't exactly saving for a rainy day. Instead, they kept looking for new ways to spend. By the mid-1960s, the United States decided it could have everything at once. This was the era of guns and butter. The government was spending billions on the Vietnam War while simultaneously launching the Great Society programs. Politicians had learned that spending money made them popular. It was a sugar high that no one wanted to end. For all this, the government had to print for all this. The government had to print more money and take on more debt. The first major crack in the system appeared in 1971. For decades, the global financial system was tied to the price of gold. But the U.S. had spent so much that it couldn't keep its promise to back the dollar with gold anymore. In a historic move, President Richard Nixon officially ended the gold standard. This changed the nature of money forever. From that moment on, money was no longer a physical thing you could trade for a medal. It was a promise, backed only by the government. This move gave governments even more power to spend, but it also invited a monster called inflation. Suddenly, the old Keynesian rules stopped working. In the 1970s, the world hit a wall known as stagflation. This was a nightmare scenario where prices were rising rapidly while the economy was shrinking. According to the original theory, this shouldn't have been possible. You noticed the shift in the late 70s as people began to realize that just throwing money at a problem didn't always fix it. The drama reached a boiling point at gas stations and grocery stores. People watched their life savings lose value every single month. Interest rates eventually had to skyrocket to nearly 20% just to stop the bleeding. It was a brutal reality check for the idea that governments could spend their way to happiness. Analysts still argue about whether the 70s crisis was a failure of Keynesian theory or just a failure of political willpower. Some thought this would be the end of big government spending. Figures like Ronald Reagan and Margaret Thatcher rose to power promising to cut the waste. They talked about smaller government and tighter budgets, but even then, the total debt didn't really go down. It just changed direction. You watch as the gold standard dies and realize that the era of easy money had left a permanent mark on how leaders think. The addiction to debt was already baked into the system. Even when the crisis of the 70s faded, the habit of borrowing against the future remained. The world had moved into a new phase where growth was fueled by credit rather than savings. You might feel like the story was over, but the biggest spending sprees were actually still to come. The ghost of Keynes was about to get a second life in the digital age. By the early 2000s, the global economy looked like a high-speed train running on invisible tracks. But in 2008, those tracks suddenly vanished. You look at the headlines from that September and see the names of legendary banks simply disappearing overnight. The world was facing a total financial meltdown. For a moment, it looked like the Great Depression was about to have a very ugly sequel. Governments didn't hesitate this time. They didn't just open the checkbook, they essentially bought the whole bank. This was the moment the too big to fail era truly began. To stop the bleeding, central banks use a new tool called quantitative easing. It sounds like a complex medical procedure. In reality, it was just a fancy way of saying they created trillions of dollars out of thin air. They used this new cash to buy up government debt and mortgage bonds. The goal was to flood the system with so much money that the gears would have to start turning again. It worked, but it changed the rules of the game. For the next decade, interest rates stayed near zero. Borrowing money became almost free. You notice something strange happening during this period. The stock market kept hitting record highs, but the average person's paycheck barely moved. This created a massive gap between the financial world and the real world. Governments got used to the idea that they could borrow trillions without any immediate consequences. The ghost of Keynes was no longer just a guest at the party. He was the one pouring the drinks. Then, just as the world was trying to get back to normal, the 2020 pandemic hit. If 2008 was a localized fire, 2020 was a global flood. Governments across the world shut down their entire economies to save lives. To keep people fed and businesses afloat, they launched the largest spending spree in human history. In the United States alone, the government sent out checks directly to households. They gave hundreds of billions in forgivable loans to businesses. You see the numbers and they are hard to wrap your head around. We aren't talking about millions or even billions anymore. We are talking about multiple trillions of dollars moving in just a few months. It was a massive real-time experiment in economic survival. For a while, it seemed to work perfectly. The poverty rate actually dropped in some places despite the lockdowns, but there is no such thing as a free lunch in economics. All that new money started chasing a limited supply of goods. You probably noticed the price of eggs and gas starting to creep up shortly after. This sparked a heated new conversation among the experts. There's still a real disagreement on whether this massive stimulus saved the world or just lit the fuse for a future disaster. By the time the lockdowns ended, the global debt pile had reached heights that were previously unimaginable. People began to wonder if we could ever go back to the old way of doing things. The idea of a balanced budget started to sound like a fairy tale from a distant land. The world had become addicted to cheap money and endless government support. But as the calendar turned toward the mid-2020s, the side effects of this medicine were becoming impossible to ignore. The bill was finally arriving in the mail. The new normal was about to meet a very old problem, the math of interest rates. You watch as central banks realize they can't just keep the party going forever. We're tiny. The total balance was just a we're tiny. The total balance was just a number on a screen. But the world changed when inflation stuck around longer than anyone expected. To fight it, central banks had to do the one thing governments hate most. They raised interest rates. Suddenly, the free money era was over. The math of 2026 is simple, but pretty brutal. When interest rates go up, the cost of carrying all that debt goes up too. Think of it like a mortgage that suddenly resets to a much higher rate. By early 2026, reports showed a startling trend. The United States was spending more on interest payments than on its entire defense budget. This wasn't just a paper problem anymore. It was a massive drain on the actual treasury. Every dollar spent on interest is a dollar that can't go towards schools or roads. This is the debt trap that many people warned about for decades. In the past, governments could always count on the economy growing faster than the debt. But with higher rates and aging populations, that growth is getting harder to find. The tension in capital cities is palpable. Politicians are now caught between a rock and a hard place. If they cut spending to pay down the debt, the economy might crash. If they keep spending, inflation could come roaring back. There is no easy exit ramp anymore. You look at the federal budget and see a giant machine that only knows how to move in one direction. The drama isn't just happening in the halls of power. It's hitting the real world too. Higher rates mean it's more expensive to buy a house or start a small business. The government is essentially competing with its own citizens for the same pool of money. This drives borrowing costs even higher for everyone else. You see the problem clearly when looking at the sheer scale of the numbers. We are talking about interest bills that total over $1 trillion a year. It feels like the ghost of Keynes is finally sending over the bill for the last 50 years of parties. Finance people still go back and forth on whether we can simply grow out of this debt or if a major crisis is eventually inevitable. Some argue that as long as the world still wants to hold dollars, the game can continue. Others point to history and say that no empire has ever survived this level of leverage. There's a real sense of unease as we navigate this new landscape. You realize that the tools used to save the economy in 2008 and 2020 might not work this time. The safety net has been stretched so thin that it's starting to tear. Every time a new problem pops up, the instinctive reaction is to print more and spend more. But in 2026, that move comes with a much higher price tag. The era of the blank check is hitting a hard limit. The global credit card is finally bumping up against its maximum balance. You might feel like the exit is blocked, but the world is still searching for a way out. We've spent the last century acting like the global credit card had no limit. For a long time, that seemed true. As long as someone was willing to buy government bonds, the spending could stay high. But in 2026, the world is hitting a wall of reality. The other people whose money we've been spending, the lenders, the pension funds, and the foreign investors, are starting to ask tougher questions. They aren't just looking for a safe place to park their cash anymore. They are demanding higher returns because they see the growing risk of all that accumulated debt. The total global debt is now a number so large it loses all meaning. It is roughly $300 trillion. To put that in perspective, if you spent $1 every second, it would take you nearly 10 million years to pay it off. That is the mountain of obligations we've built since the days of Keynes. You might think this is just a problem for accountants and politicians. But the consequences are starting to show up in the most basic parts of life. Governments are facing the great squeeze. On one side, they have promised massive benefits to an aging population. On the other side, the cost of servicing their existing debt is eating up every spare cent. There is no longer any room for error. When a new crisis hits, the old trick of just printing more money doesn't work like it used to. In 2026, doing that just triggers a fresh wave of inflation that hurts the very people the government is trying to help. This tension is leading to some very uncomfortable choices. Some countries are forced to raise taxes to levels that stifle growth. Others are quietly cutting services that people have relied on for decades. It is a slow-motion collision between the promises of the past and the math of the present. You see this play out in every budget debate and every election cycle. The drama isn't about which project to fund anymore. It's about which vital program has to be sacrificed to keep the lights on. There is a growing sense that the era of easy answers has ended. For decades, the ghost of Keynes provided a convenient escape hatch whenever things got difficult. If the economy slowed down, you just lowered rates and spent more. But now that interest rates are higher and debt is at record levels, that hatch is rusted shut. Economists still debate whether we are witnessing a permanent shift in how money works or just a temporary bump in the road. Some argue that we need a complete reset of the global financial system. Others believe we can still innovate our way out of this through new technology and productivity. But regardless of the theory, the practical reality is the same for everyone. We are living in the shadow of a century-long spending spree. The bill is no longer a future problem. It is a today problem. You realize that the decisions made in the next few years will define the economic landscape for the rest of our lives. The story of John Maynard Keynes began with a desire to save the world from a single, terrible depression. He succeeded in many ways. He gave us the tools to manage crises and provide a safety net for millions. But he also left us with a system that finds it almost impossible to stop. We have mastered the art of spending, but we have yet to master the art of restraint. Now that we've traced the long journey of global spending, I'd love to hear your thoughts on where we go from here. It's a complex world, and everyone feels the impact of these big economic shifts in different ways. Where are you watching this from today? Whether you're in a bustling city or a quiet town, I'm curious to know how you're seeing these changes in your own local economy. Many people are focusing on building more. Many people are focusing on building more resilience or changing how they think about their personal finances. Drop a comment below and let's get a conversation going. It's always fascinating to see the global perspective from people in different corners of the world. If you found this deep dive into the ghost of Keynes and the world of debt helpful, please consider hitting the like button. It really helps the channel grow and allows us to keep making these stories for you. And if you haven't already, subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss our next look at the forces shaping our world. We have plenty of more stories lined up that break down the big ideas into something we can all understand. Thank you for spending some of your time with me today. Stay grounded, stay curious, and I'll see you in the next one.